All right, so our topic today, we got this fancy word, euthanasia. And I was trying to find, there was an old Saturday Night Live clip from the 70s with Gilda Radner. She had this character called Rosanna Nanadana, and she always got the news stories wrong. And she was going on this rant about, what's all this talk about euthanasia? We got enough of our own youth to worry about in this country. And it has nothing to do with youth or Asians. It's the Greek word for good, happy, or gentle death. And so the way you may have heard this before, it would be like death with dignity, the right to die movement, mercy killing, that sort of mentality. And when we're navigating, like I said, even though I don't believe in processes or formulas, I do have a process I go through. So on a topic like this, the first thing I'm asking myself from my Christian worldview or perspective is, are there any biblical examples of mercy killing? Well, let's just start with, are there any biblical examples? And then we can see if the Bible said if that was a good or bad thing.
They call Saul killed him because he was captured by the people.
Right.
And then the guy that listened to the king got killed by the other king.
So Saul's the classic one, right? He's on the battlefield, he's mortally wounded, he's going to die, and the Philistines are coming, and he asks his armor bearer, take my life, run me through, because I don't want these heathens to torture me and defile me. And his armor bearer wouldn't do it. And he ends up basically falling on his own sword. And then there's more to the story though, right? Was it a Hittite? I can't remember. Some other guy came and told David, he brought the crown and his bucklers, and he says, here you go, David. I took that guy out for you. And David was just like, how dare you? That was the Lord's anointed, and had him executed on the spot. So that was a very unpositive euthanasia story. Can you think of any others in the Bible? What about Jesus?
That was not mercy killing. That was a sacrifice.
But he did lay down his own life. No one could take it from him.
Yeah.
In a sense,
It
was a sacrifice.
Mercy killing, or like I'm gonna sacrifice my life so I can save my wife. That's not the same thing.
But think of what Christ's death saved. Not to be all utilitarian about it, but his death satisfied that enmity we had with God for all people. And so in that sense, the death itself wasn't good. Like we call it Good Friday, but it's Good Friday because we know the rest of the story, that he reconciled us to God. He broke the bondage of hell. The captives were set free, and we were reconciled to God. So the resurrection and reconciliation is what makes it good, not the horror of the death and torture. All right, so I always just thought this was a no-brainer because in our culture, at least, we have different words for when you kill another human being. When you kill another human, we call it homicide. And when you kill yourself, we call it suicide. And basically what euthanasia is trying to do is have almost like an in-between category between these two. Because unlike killing others or even killing yourself, the intention, this is kind of like the intentionality piece. The intention isn't because you hate the person or they're an inconvenience or you want an early inheritance. You're doing it out of love, compassion, care for the other because you don't want to see them suffer, or maybe they're mentally gone and it's just their body there, or whatever the scenario is. And a lot of people are uncomfortable though, making this sort of like a legal option. And when I first started teaching this class over 20 years ago, there was only one state that had right to die, it had right to die legislation. Let me see if I can bring up. There we go. Can you guys see that shared map? Okay. So you can see we got our West Coast states, which makes sense. Oregon, for years, was the only state it was legal to practice euthanasia. And it was usually called like physician-assisted suicide. But there were requirements. You had to be a resident of the state. They didn't want people just flying in and committing suicide in a Portland hotel over the weekend. So you had to establish residency, and there were certain protocols. I think you had to have a doctor's diagnosis that you only had less than 6 months to live. So this wasn't just if you were depressed or didn't see any prospects in your life, but it was like if you were dealing with a terminal illness, you were suffering and you just wanted it to be over. And then in the last decade, we've had 7 other states join Oregon and the District of Columbia. So there you go. In 41 states, though, it's still illegal. But that was always a strange thing to me. Like, why would we make suicide illegal? I understand making homicide illegal, but if someone wants to take their own life, what are you going to do? Charge them with self-murder after they're dead? Or what if they survive the attempt? Are you going to incarcerate them for attempted suicide? I mean, that doesn't make sense to me.
I think it's though, it's the person assisting them. So like the doctor that would be helping them, they would be held accountable for the person.
Oh yeah, let's talk about doctors that help. The most famous, of course, is Jack Kevorkian. His nickname was Dr. Death. And he was a champion of the right to die movement, or the euthanasia movement. And what's so interesting to me is he was able to avoid prosecution for over a decade by using double effect. And if you remember natural law theory and double effect, he said, my intention is to end the pain and suffering. The unintended side effect is the pain medications will end their lives. And so, but eventually he switched it and he said, I'm going to use death as a means to end suffering. And he was put immediately in prison for homicide. Isn't that amazing? He was doing the same thing, but he changed the intentionality. It would be like if you have a baseball bat in the back of your truck or whatever, and the police says, what's the baseball bat for? If you say self-defense, you could be charged with a concealed weapon. If you say I'm into baseball, it's just a bat. So that intentionality piece actually, but he thought that America was ready. And because he was trying to get this legislation passed. So he skipped the loophole, the double effect loophole, and just was upfront about what he was doing and spent, I think, at least 10 years in jail. Because he would make these little kits that would allow people to kill themselves. Fascinating. Okay. But I think because of him, it became much more part of the conversation of the nation at large. And who knows, we might have memorial Kevorkian euthanasia centers named after him 10 years from now. It wouldn't surprise me in the least. All right, in the old book I used to use with Geisler, he described, first he wanted to make a difference between active and passive euthanasia. So active means you're actually killing another person. Right, this passive would be maybe you're not providing shelter or medicine or food or things you need to stay alive. This might be putting a pillow over their face or overdosing them on pills or taking them out behind the woodshed and ending their pain, whatever it may be. So we have active and passive, and Geisler was adamantly opposed to active mercy killing. But in our popular culture, you guys ever see Saving Private Ryan? There's a scene where a guy gets shot up. He's in excruciating pain. He was the medic, and he's like, morphine, give me morphine. And they kept giving him morphine, and the other guy with some medical background, he's like, if you keep doing that, you're gonna kill him. And the guy's like, more morphine. And they basically OD'd him on morphine. Their intention wasn't to kill him, but he was already dying from his wounds, and they were just trying to make it as peaceful as possible. But that's kind of like, I don't know, maybe that's like somewhere in between these two. If you saw Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis, there's a scene where that English officer is captured by the Hurons, and they're about to burn him alive. And even though they weren't buddies, he was kind of doing him, he thought he was doing him a favor. He got out his long rifle and from about 100 yards, put a bullet between the guy's eyes as he's about to get burned to death. That's euthanasia. It's a mercy killing. He didn't kill him because they were after the same girl or because they were on different sides of the war or any of that. It was, he didn't want to see another person burned alive. Mercy killing.
So what about, like, let's say someone's in a coma for however long, and then they get put on a vent, and then would it taking them off the vent be part of the euthanasia?
Kind of passive though, because you're not killing them, you're just removing artificial systems and then their natural response to die.
Right. And that's what Geisler would call unnatural passive, where you are removing any unnatural or extra means to keep them alive, like a ventilator or a dialysis machine or those sorts of things. And basically by unplugging that life support, they are going to pass. And this is the one he was in favor of. He wasn't even okay with this one, but this one he was okay with. That's like you stop feeding them or giving them shelter, or, but you're not actively killing them. You're just letting their body go. And a lot of people will passively euthanize themselves. Older people, they'll simply stop eating, stop taking the whatever it may be. They're just done. And you would have to keep them alive. You would have to feed them against their will, basically, to keep them alive. And that's where it gets weird for me. Like I said, this seemed pretty straightforward to me until I saw this movie, I think it was made in the 70s, called Whose Life Is It Anyways? And it starred Richard Dreyfuss as a younger actor. He's probably in his early 30s. And his character in this movie, I would highly recommend this. If anyone can find a copy, let me know. I loaned mine out years ago and I can't find it again. But Whose Life Is It Anyways with Richard Dreyfuss. And he was an artist, a sculptor, and he basically lived his life through his hands. And he would create beautiful sculptures and artworks. And he was also a very popular college professor on the side to probably supplement his artistic income. And everyone loved him. He was charismatic, easygoing. He had a beautiful fiance. And one day on his way home from work in his little convertible sports car, he ended up going under a semi truck, broke his neck, and woke up as a quadriplegic. And when he was finally conscious enough to be able to talk to the doctor said, "We've worked on you for weeks. We've taken care of all your broken bones, all the internal bleeding, and we're happy to report you're stable and you're going to survive. The bad news is you're never going to walk or use your hands again." And he was just very calm, and he said, "Thank you." And the doctor says, "For what?" He says, "For being honest with me." And after he had a few days to process it, he began to ask his family and friends and fiance to come visit him, and he told them all goodbye. Because as far as he was concerned, his life was over, because his life was in his hands. That was his mentality. And whether you and I agree with that or not, that was his view. And so he told the doctors, well, he told his fiance, he said, if you love me, mourn me, but consider me dead. I'm gone now. And she respected his wishes, said goodbye, grieved him. And all his other friends and family were so mad at her. And she was like, look, I respect him, I love him. And if you respected and loved him too, you would obey his wishes and stop trying to get him to find some new kind of purpose or life. Just let him go. And the doctor, when he told the doctor, I don't want any more care, and I'm going to stop eating. I'm not asking you to kill me, but I don't want to eat anymore. And the doctor said, no, you're obviously depressed. You're not in your right mind. And so they started to intravenously feed him. And because he was a quadriplegic, he couldn't even pull the food tubes out of his throat or his arm. And that was so horrifying to me, thinking, if you were quadriplegic and other people are doing stuff to your body and you have no control over it, and they're actually keeping you alive against your will, it just almost seemed evil. And he finally got a lawyer to represent him, and he won his case over his own body, that the hospital did not have the right to keep him alive against their will. And the judge said, now the hospital can refuse to have you there. They don't have to be the place where you die, but they can't treat you against your will. And the judge said, I hope you change your mind. I know several people who have had similar injuries, and they have gone on to become teachers or lawyers or whatever, but it is your life, it's your body, it's your choice. And that really resonated with me. It certainly wasn't a Christian movie. And from a Christian perspective, remember 1 Corinthians 6, it makes such a big deal that our bodies are not our own. We were bought with a price. Our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so from my perspective, I don't feel like I have the right over my own body when to let it go, that's the choice of God. But on the other hand, I also don't feel like I have the right to force other people to stay connected to their body even when they want to leave. That seems like that's between them and their maker.
So with DNR, maybe I'm making yourself, do not resuscitate without being.
That would be passive, unnatural.
So that would still be the same thing if something happens to me, just don't.
Right.
Well, at that point, you're kind of dying naturally, though, so you're not really being euthanized, you just die. You don't want to be tried to.
You don't want to be brought back.
Your natural cause of death.
And that was my good friend Carl, my quadriplegic friend for 30 years. He had a DNR. And he always wore his bracelet. So if he got checked in, it would be right there. Do not. Some people even have it like tattooed on their chest because they're afraid their friends or family will intervene. And they have it right there. Do not resuscitate in a tattoo. And I hope this isn't too personal information. He's gone, so I think it's okay. But Steve Whitten was his medical, I forget what you call it.
Like a representative.
Right. So so if Carl was unconscious and couldn't make those decisions, they would ask Steve what to do. And Steve was adamantly opposed to it because he loved Carl. And he told Carl, no, I'm going to ask them to do everything. And he said, Steve, it's not about, this is my life. You don't understand how hard my life is. And if God takes me, which I pray for every day, he wasn't suicidal, but he wanted to be out of his broken body. It was so hard. And he had a great attitude, but he's like, if I die, how dare you bring me back? when I just want to be free. I want a new body. I want to be with Jesus. And I get it. And towards the end of his life, my buddy Carl, he had this heart condition. On top of his being a quadriplegic, he had a genetic heart condition that for an able-bodied person, they could have gone in, replaced the weak valve, and gone on with their lives. But because he was so weak, they couldn't crack the sternum to go in and do that kind of surgery. He never would have recovered probably or survived the surgery. And so his doctor gave him, I don't know what it was called, but I basically called it a suicide pill. And it was this fat old horse pill. And he said, basically what would happen is that part of his heart would just blow up like a water balloon. And the blood would just rush into it, expand it, and then it would explode into his chest. And it would be extremely painful, but wouldn't take very long. And that pill was meant to just instantaneously deaden the pain, but it was so powerful, if you took that pill, you were probably not waking back up. And there were a few times in our travels together, Carl asked me to give him that pill, and I was just like, I can't, Carl. I love you. I will hold you in my arms till your last breath, but I can't. And I just made that clear to him. You can ask someone else. I'm not doing it. I just didn't feel like I had that liberty or freedom because to me that would have been more active. I would be actively giving him something that would kill him. Even though the intention could have been to alleviate the pain, I knew what it would do. Maybe if he hadn't told me what it would do, I would have given it to him, but he pretty much said, if you give me this pill, I will die. And that was a lot. And I don't know, I was brought up as a country kid where we had animals, we killed our own chickens and rabbits and we'd hunt wild animals. And we were always taught, you're never cruel. You always go for the kill shot. You don't want animals to suffer. You treat them with respect. And growing up with that mentality, I had a little mouse as a pet. And I'd like to take him outside so he could get exercise. And one day he was making a dash for the bushes. And so I took my little can, took him out in the yard to catch him, and it landed square on his back, and I broke his back. And he was just crawling around with his front two paws, and I just felt awful. And he's like whimpering, little mouse whimpers. And my daddy's cowboy boots were on the front porch, and so I just took his boot and I sent my little mouse buddy into eternity and had a little sermon and all that. And I just thought that was because I was taught you don't let animals suffer. Yeah. And that's part of the argument. It's like, if we have compassion on animals, why wouldn't we have the same sort of compassion on other human beings?
Animals all are tied to eternity like humans are.
We don't know that though. Well, you might want to check out Ecclesiastes 3 then. Where it talks about who knows if the soul of man goes upwards and the soul of beasts go downwards into the earth. We don't. Yes, the wisest man who ever lived. I'm sorry?
There's no scripture in the New Testament that points to animals having souls other than like the divine heaven.
Well, because the animals have souls, animals do have souls.
Well, spirits that live on forever and ever and ever. And even if they are, they're not tied to self like they.
Well, I say that, but they have.
They're gonna be burning in hell.
Okay. I would love to, we can make that a whole topic, but I want to keep going on the euthanasia piece. So I'm kind of conflicted there between, I have this one policy towards animals, I have a different policy towards humans, and then I see this Richard Dreyfuss movie, and all of a sudden, it was such a compelling euthanasia argument. And even if I don't personally think it's the right choice, the idea of imposing my beliefs onto other people didn't seem right to me.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
for me at least, it seems to make a difference whether the person in question is a believer or not a believer. Because if you're not a believer and you want to die, then my love for you would be, hold on, before you actually make that decision, and you go into eternity, should I make sure you get saved first, or at least hear the gospel first, or do whatever I can to do to preach the gospel to you. Now, on the other hand, if you're a believer, I understand death no longer has its sting, even so it would seem to make a difference in the decision, at least for my.
But then their body's also no longer their own.
No, yeah, I agree with that, but I'm just saying,
Right.
it mainly applies to the unbeliever. I wouldn't want an unbeliever, especially with someone I love who wants to die.
And I don't want to derail onto another topic, but I've heard that same argument about capital punishment. Like, where certain people don't want to apply capital punishment to non-believers, but they're okay applying it to believers.
No, yeah, but I would hold no capital punishment for anybody. So,
But it was the same kind of argument. As long as your immortal soul was secure, then the body, it becomes secondary. So I get your point. All right. Now, see, it's one thing sitting in this air-conditioned classroom, comfortable, we're all in relatively decent health, even though we're wearing these plague masks, and having this conversation. It's a whole nother thing when it's someone you love sitting there begging you to make the pain go away. And I pray that none of you have to experience that. I've got to experience it too many times already in my life, and I probably have to do it again. But this really helped me teaching this for 20 years before I had to be in that position with my family. And I'll tell you that story later, but with my 21-year-old nephew with cystic fibrosis, he had finally got to the point, he had maybe 10% lung capacity. He was number one on the transplant lung list, and we're just holding on. And how do you pray that, right? Please, God, provide lungs, because the only way he's going to get lungs is if someone else dies. And it just is such a head trip, because you certainly don't want another person to have to die so that your loved one can live. But we're down to that kind of intensity. And, on this death watch for a couple weeks, he's hooked up to machines. He can no longer breathe on his own. We're just waiting for these lungs. And then he finally ends up getting a staph infection in the hospital. And they're like, I'm sorry, even if we got lungs this afternoon, we can't put him in because of his infection. And there's no way that we can save his body that he can fight off the infection. And so they took him off the list, and then they basically said, we were basically keeping him alive, waiting for the transplant, but now that that's no longer an option, what do you want us to do? And she's like, good Lord. Because if they shut off the machine, he's going to die. And they had ethicists and euthanasiasts at the hospital and with hospice people. And we had like this family conference with the doctors and nurses. And we basically got to live through all this stuff we're talking about in class. And my family was so torn right down the middle. Half of the family was like, let him go. The poor kid has suffered for his whole life, let him go. And then we had other relatives who were just incredulous, like, how can you give up? He's a fighter, let him keep, and we're just like, no, you don't understand. He's been fighting his whole life. The fight's over, it's done. The only thing keeping him alive is that machine. And as soon as we unplug it, he'll be dead within hours. And that was really tough. So what I had to explain to my family was we are not killing him. We are simply removing these unnatural means that are keeping his broken body alive. But he can no longer live without those machines. And he made it so clear when he was alive, he did not want to live like that. And eventually we were able to talk with the doctors, and they were great. They weren't pushing us one way, they just wanted us to understand what was happening. But some people, they can't let go, right? And they'll keep a loved one on life support weeks, months, sometimes years. And I don't know if that person's soul is still in the body, if the body is still there and the soul has left. I don't know, because we don't have soul monitors, right? We can't do a scan and say, oh, the soul's gone. So we're using physiological things like brain waves. And
Yeah, so what is dead? You know?
I would say it's when the soul departs.
No,
but
I know from that view, yes, but since we can't.
by
gauge
our
that-
modern community, they usually use brain
Right,
waves
right, yeah,
to
yeah.
determine. All right, so I didn't mean to tell that story yet, but that was a rough one. I have a short clip I want to show you, just so you can feel some of the emotion. And it's rough. I mean, you're going to actually watch someone commit suicide, so brace yourself or look away if you don't.
I got
It's-
a good question.
Yeah.
Just for my understanding, because I personally have never been through this, is there like a time period that they can be on machines that are like keeping them alive?
I think it's definitely, right?
Well, you got my good day.
Is that-
Yeah, it depends on
Is it the cost?
your insurance and other things, yeah.
Isn't it also too sometimes like if hospitals like don't have the space or whatever?
Yep.
Like if something happens, you need that day.
And I don't want to get too crazy, but if you're an organ donor,
Yeah,
that could affect it.
yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of being organ donors, especially because of my nephews and stuff. I saw what that meant to families. And I didn't even know it, but as soon as my nephew had passed, that was the hardest thing. After they took him off the machine, he still fought for life for hours. Oh my God, that was it. You just watching someone suffocating, before your eyes. But we were there, we got to hold him. And once I'd never seen the light leave someone's eyes before. That was so interesting to me. I remember for weeks after he passed, I couldn't stop looking at other humans' eyes because there's a light in the living that is not there in the dead. And I was just so fascinated seeing people's eyes and the light in them. But the reason I bring that up is because as soon as he was pronounced dead, they very politely said, your nephew has donated his eyes and we need to collect them now. And we're not trying to be rude or insensitive, but we need them now. And we were so touched by that. Even in his own death or weakness, he was thinking about others. I think it was okay with the eyes or whatever, but he even donated his diseased lungs for research so that they could try to help people that came after him. And that was really wonderful. And I really hope someday we get to meet that person. I would love to see light in those eyes again. But, that's that person's choice, of course. All right, so here's, I believe this is Switzerland, and they were one of the first countries in the world to allow physician-assisted suicide. And once again, you had to come with a doctor's note. You had to be terminally ill, like 6 months to live, and you had to take whatever the potion or pills were that was going to end your life. They would not inject you or do it for you. So you at least had to be in a place where you could at least take your own death potion or mix. And so it's a little intense, but I think it's worth our time. It's 10 minutes. You hit the lights
Good
anyway.
evening and welcome to 16 by 9, The Bigger Picture. I'm Mary Garofalo. It is the controversial documentary about suicide that everyone's talking about because you actually witnessed a man dying on screen. It recently aired on British television and caused.
If you want to see the full 54-minute documentary, it's on my ethics playlist. I think the second one from the bottom, but this is like the condensed version.
Quite an uproar. Tonight, we'll show you that incredible documentary and talk to the Canadian filmmaker who made it.
Mr. York, you like this? dying.
They are welcoming words to a dying man, but to others, a haunting preamble to a never-before-seen moment on television, a moment that has stirred heated controversy.
I am dying.
This guy is so sweet.
There is no sense in trying to deny that fact.
The film, called The Suicide Tourist, was remade Right to Die in Britain. It chronicles the story of 59-year-old Craig Ewart, an American professor living in Britain, dying from ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. Ewart approached the Dignitas Clinic in Zurich, Switzerland, to help assist in his suicide, with cameras rolling.
It was certainly the most difficult professional experience in my life.
Canadian documentary maker John Turitsky is at the center of the storm.
They were constantly suggesting I was a foolish filmmaker who had done it for money and was out chasing ratings. And that's the reason I had included the death of Craig Ewart in the film.
I'm not really asking myself if I want to do it or not. I do want to do it. But you know, there are other things in my life that I wanted to do that I didn't do.
With his wife of 37 years, Mary, at his side, it is clear that life for this former professor was hard. He was on a ventilator with no ability to walk or take care of himself. Ewart at times seemed to struggle with his decision to die, but realized his choices.
If I go through with it, I die, as I must at some point. If I don't go through with it, my choice is essentially to suffer and to inflict suffering on my family. And then die.
The documentary follows this dying man to the Dignitas Clinic in Zurich, where since 1997, they've assisted in some 700 suicides.
Dignitas gets people from all over the world who come to Zurich. They have to send their medical records in advance. Those records are examined by a Swiss doctor. And then when the individual arrives in Zurich, he meets with the doctor to see whether the doctor will indeed prescribe the fatal dose of barbiturates that's needed in order to have an assisted suicide.
Ludwig Manelli is a former human rights lawyer who runs Dignitas.
If somebody's coming and tells us, I have enough of this awful life and I would like to go now, we should have the opportunity to help him.
And the heart-wrenching last moments of Ewart's life explode quietly on the screen. There is the last night between husband and wife, spent together, both knowing their 37 years together were now counting down to their last few hours.
And you've been very strong with this. You've cried on occasion, but by and large, you've been supportive of my choices. And you've always been there for me to talk with. And when I'm scared, I talk with you.
Ewart arrives at the clinic and the process that would lead to his death. 63-year-old Arthur Bernard is a retired social worker who works for Dignitas. He is here to assist with the suicide. It is explained that Ewart will be given a deadly cocktail of barbiturates mixed with apple juice.
Basically, the cocktail is the same drug that's used to euthanize animals. Like that's used to euthanize, to kill dogs and horses, and the dosage is given in such high amounts that it would indeed kill a horse.
So, dying again, you're a signature.
Get the elbow a bit so I can actually do something.
I think that's a good thing. I was looking through the list of states and the requirements, and 8 of the 9 states or districts that have approved euthanasia, you have to have 2 verbal requests of your doctor, 15 days apart, And then the third request has to be written. But see, with this man with the ALS, he can't write anymore. And so I'm wondering, what do you do with someone like that? Or like my quadriplegic friend, right? Can he speak it and dictate it? I mean, I'm sure there's some sort of legal provision, but this is part of his concern. Because this is a degenerative disease, it's going to come to a point where he couldn't even sip through a straw anymore. And then he wouldn't even be able to get help taking his own life. He would simply be left at the mercy of others. And so there is a time constraint here because of the debilitating nature of this disease, where he had this window. If I'm going to do this, I have to do it in this next couple weeks. Otherwise, I'm just going to have to live this out and be on life support till I die.
When you drink the last medicament, I usually make a video just of the act of drinking. So the Swiss officials, that they can see that you have drunk it yourself and nobody else. Of course, if it's necessary, I can roll with the glass. You have to drink it yourself. Huh? So if you don't mind, I'll make this video. If you have no
Yes,
objection.
yes, sir, it's not my intent to cause difficulties for anyone.
Oh, God.
I have a fake journey. See you sometime. And then the moment that is at the center of the controversy.
Mr. Ewart, if you drink this, you're going to die. Hmm?
Yes, sir. Oh. Can I have some music?
With his wife at his side, Craig Ewart dies.
I was relieved for Craig Ewart because I knew how badly he wanted to end his life and what a relief it would be for him. And so I was relieved that it had gone easily and well for him. And I was also relieved that my crew and I were able to hold it together, keep it together, and that we had been able to capture what I felt were some very rare and important footage that would contribute to the debate all around the world.
Assisted suicide is illegal in Canada and in England. And recently, when this documentary aired in Britain, the debate catapulted from the tabloid headlines all the way to the House of Commons.
I believe that it's necessary to ensure that there is never a case in the country where a sick or elderly person feels under pressure to agree to an assisted death.
There were accusations that this might spark copycat suicide.
I find that this is one of the most ludicrous charges that's leveled against me and the film. And that, it's always suggested that there'll be copycats who will come along encouraging more suicides, and then people are going to start jumping on tall buildings and off bridges, and it just isn't so.
And for Mary Ewart, the controversy is irrelevant because the suicide was her husband's wish.
In a sense, I lost Craig 6 months ago, as he was
I say I feel his presence. Now, some people that would be like the spirit hovering or whatever. I don't know, but I know that we had a great time together and that he left me with a lot of happy memories. So where he is really immaterial.
Many groups that lobby against the right to die say that the fear of pain is what drives most people to seek assisted suicide, though we do not endorse any position. You can learn more about the debate by logging on to our website.
Okay. Okay, so like what I like to do with a lot of these topics is to go through various pros and cons. And some of the pros would be like it's personal choice, it's merciful, compassionate, it provides resolution. You're not in this limbo place for weeks or months or years at a time. I don't know if you guys remember the the Schreibo case, where it was a woman, she had choked and had become basically in a vegetative state. She couldn't even feed or bathe herself or go to the bathroom by herself. That all had to be done to others. I mean, they would have to spoon feed. She could still eat with her mouth, but she would have to be spoon fed like a baby. And her husband eventually said, you know what, I think we need to stop doing this. We're basically keeping this personal life who's not there. But her parents were like, no, every time we go to visit, we know she's still in there. And he's like, no, you're projecting, she's gone, let her go. But there were other problems because, for one, there was religion involved. It was a Catholic family. And with their belief system, if you committed suicide, you didn't get to go to heaven. Now, I think that's a false belief. And I don't know if there's any change in Catholic theology on that, but the idea is you're committing a sin that you can't confess for. And so you die basically in your sins. And I don't believe that's how forgiveness of sin works. I think we're forgiven for all our sins, past, present, future, by the personal work of Christ. But that was part of the concern of the parents because she may have caused her own problem by causing herself to choke to death, tried to kill herself, but survived it and ended up as a vegetative state. So they were invested in keeping her alive so she didn't die as a result of her actions. And her husband wanted to remarry and didn't feel free to do that if he had a living wife. So there were layers upon layers. But what tripped me out is the conservative right came in and they were like, who are you to play God? You don't get to decide when to stop treating her. But I'm thinking, you started playing God the minute you gave her that above and beyond care, because she would have died 20 years ago. You've been playing God for 20 years. It's not like you're playing God now when you decide we're no longer going to do this. It's all playing God in that sense. So I love this, but the thing is perspective, right? Think of how many people, because they were so overwhelmed by the current moment, wanted to end their lives. So I do like the provisions of the waiting period. You can't just pop into a clinic and having a bad day and say, okay, doc, I want to end it. But they want to make sure it's not just situational or seasonal depression or disorder. The financial relief could also be problematic if you had unscrupulous relatives that wanted to speed you on your way because they wanted your resources. And that's what that clip of that British legislator was saying. If we go down this path, we need to ensure that no one is compelled or influenced against their will to end their life. But you could see how that could happen, right? Even my grandparents had this mentality, oh, we don't want to be a burden on anyone. You kids live your own lives. We lived our life. When it's our time to go, let us die. And that's hard, right? With people you love. But I could see where people could feel the pressure like, oh, I'm a drag on my family. And if I would just die, I'm worth more to them dead than I am to them alive. And I think we need to be very careful that that's not what's motivating us. But if it is out of mercy, care, compassion, that would be really hard for me to condemn or judge people on. I don't want to. I just want to make sure their heart and intentions are correct. Obviously, God's not going to be surprised at the day of anyone's death, whether it went through a long process or they went to Switzerland and drank a toxic mix. God knows. But I think it's important for each of you to become clear in your own minds how you think God would have you act in this situation, and then to let your relatives know about it. I mean, think of and I don't think economics should be the guiding factor, but think about the extraordinary costs to keep someone alive. I mean, it could deplete your entire family's resources. All your houses would be mortgaged, all these bills, all your inheritance. And for what? To keep a body there when the person is no longer even engaged with that body. And that seems like a problem. To me, Geisler called that, you're not preserving life, you're prolonging death. You're like dragging out the inevitable.
I think that's where again, we're still not like, are we okay with the passive, unnatural side of things? But I think force feeding somebody is unnatural, you know. But like, are we going to like, oh hey, I'm a WAMT, I'm a triple amputee, like it still functions bigger than now, but like it just sucks. Whatever damage, I'm in pain all the time, but I'm functioning, I'm alive, I'm conscious, I'm like, I think there's two separate arguments.
Sure. And it's one thing to feed someone temporarily till they get their strength back, or you can bring them out of a coma. But if this is just, that's it, they're not going to get any, it's like, why? Why are we keeping this vehicle alive if the driver is gone?
We have those pretty good things for years, and eventually, hey, I'm awake.
Right? Did you see that Awakenings movie with Robin Williams? It's that scenario. They found this wonder drug and people were talking like in their right minds, and they had been in a coma for like 20 years. And it was like a miracle, but it only lasted for, I think, a couple weeks. And then they all went back into their sleep state. But freaky. And that was like a real life story they made into a movie. I would recommend that one, Awakenings. It's a trip. Whose life is it anyways? That's another good one. So I guess the main point I want to emphasize to you is think this out. Talk to God about it. Talk to your family and friends about it. Put it in writing, get it notarized. It will save a lot of grief for your family or loved ones later if they have to make a decision about you. And you've been very clear to them what you want. Two more stories and I'll let you go. I love Star Trek. I love the sci-fi with all the philosophy and social issues. And it was in the movie with Spock's guru half-brother. I forget the name of that one, The Undiscovered Country, I think it was. And Spock's brother was the opposite of him. He rejected the Vulcan way of logic and reason. He was like, no, we have to go with passion and emotion. That's the real path. So he was like a counterculture Vulcan. And he was like a hippie guru type. And what he would do is he would use that Vulcan mind meld technique to find out people's hidden or secret pain. And then he would share that with them to like alleviate that suffering. And Dr. McCoy's hidden pain was when he was a young medical school student. His father had some horrible alien disease and he was suffering horribly. And even with all their advanced technology, he couldn't alleviate the suffering. And his dad would say, for the love of God, if you care anything about me as your father, make the pain stop. You can do it with a push of the button. And McCoy's like, I can't, I'm a doctor. I'm sworn to the Hippocratic Oath. I'm here to preserve life, not to take it. And his father just kept begging him. And then finally one day he shut off the machine. His father passed, but that wasn't the worst part. 2 weeks later, they discovered a cure for the disease. And he had to live with that his whole life. And I'm not trying to freak you out, but that's the thing. Death is pretty final. And you don't get second chances. There is no hope. There is no God doing some miracle or some scientific cure or thing. And I'm not trying to get people to cling to false hope or things like that. I just want people to realize how serious a choice it is. This isn't flippant. You don't get take-backs or do-overs for this one. Years later, I had another animal incident in my home. This time it was with cockatiels, and my young 11-year-old nephew, I wanted to get him some pets and teach him some responsibility. And we had two, a male, female, Fiona and Oric. And Oric was not a very nice bird. And we let them free roam in our home because I don't believe in pets. And they're just flying around our thing, but they would actually grub around in the carpet for, they had gizzards, so they needed little pebbles to help break down the bird seed. And it was like finals week. I was overwhelmed. I wasn't really paying attention. And I came home and I stepped on Oric square in the back, this little bird. And both his wings went out, his tongue was out of his mouth. And my nephew was just like, Uncle, you murderer, you never liked Oric. And I'm like, no, I feel bad. And I'm having flashbacks to my mouse, my childhood mouse. And I'm about to get out the cowboy boot. And then, but I've been teaching ethics for 15 years at that point. And I was like, you know what? I really don't know. But I think, kind of like we were talking, I don't know what's going to happen to Oric when he dies. And quite frankly, he's probably not going to go to a happy place based on his life. And so I decide I'm just going to bundle him up. I figure he's going to die in the night. I'm sorry he's suffering, but at least he's living. And I just planned on getting up early, and I was going to take care of him before my nephew woke up. And lo and behold, in the morning, he had come out of his swaddling. He still had one wing off to the side, but he was like kind of hopping around the cage. And I was like, what? Because he was I'm talking dislocated limbs. I'm a big guy, little bird. And so I put some food out, water. I actually had my students pray for him. I rarely ask for prayer requests, let alone for animals. And people prayed. And when I got home, he was even in better shape. And within, I'd say, 2 weeks, he was able to fly again. And he had a very changed disposition after that. And the only reason I'm telling you those stories is we don't know the future. And who knows, back with my little mouse buddy, maybe if I would have given him more time, that was something that could have been healed, or I don't know. But that finality, I'm a lot less eager to euthanize even animals today than I would have in the past. And I'd rather take that care, comfort approach. But this is me. This is what I believe God has given me. And with human beings in particular, I believe so much in the sovereignty of God over life. I don't believe it's in my hands to take it unless God is directly telling me, Fred. But I think that's not my role. But my role may be there to hold them, soothe their brow, let them know they're loved, cared for. And I was really surprised when I did a formal trust. And as I'm filling it out, because it's in California, my paralegal or whoever this woman was that was helping me, there's a whole section on euthanasia, asking me when and how I would like to die. And I was like, Well, when my time comes, and she's like, well, you can set your own time. I was like, no, thank you. But that's actually an option in California right now. And that was just blowing me away. I mean, you have to be over 18, you have to be in your right mind, but you could actually pick a day in which to die. When I was looking at the other guidelines, it said you had to have 6 months to live. But when I was filling out the legal work, they were kind of asking me why I was in my right mind, what I wanted to happen if I found myself in that condition and could no longer communicate for myself. And so that's the thing. You could have personal euthanasia, where you end your own life, or assisted, where you're helping someone else, or then with a doctor just doing the full on thing. And right now, I think all the states require like physician assisted. You can't just take your wife of 60 years out for a long walk in the woods and leave her because she told you, if I ever get dementia, please help me pass on. That's not legal.
The other option is like if somebody gets to the point where you're having to take care of all of them, like what's your legal responsibility for your wife? So you have to be her bather, blah, 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 like.
Unfortunately, we live in a state that you could get help. It may not be the most wonderful place for care, but we do at least have resources to take care of people that don't have a safety net or family. But please think about this. And like I said, make a living will, make your wishes known to your friend's family. I think it's important. And I think a lot of it, these when does human life end, is probably just as hard a question as when it begins. But with your own conscience, your own mind, your own family, I think it's an important conversation to have. Questions, comments? I'm still waiting for ethical dilemmas, people. So if I don't get any, we're probably gonna do like capital punishment and war next week. All right. See you next week. Have a great weekend.
Yeah.